Welcome to Pleasurology Island. I'm Free Thought Steve. Thanks for stopping by. I've been recording a series of talks on the topic of ethics, which has interested me ever since I stopped being a Christian at the age of between 16 and 17, somewhere in there. I began to think, well, and particularly with relationship to sexuality. All right, if I don't believe in the Christian morality of sex, which is very simple, don't have sex unless you're married, period, and only have sex with your marital partner. Very simple set of rules to follow. But if we say, okay, we're no longer believing in Christianity because Christianity is an imagination-based worldview based on imaginary ideas about an invisible, unobservable being that the Christians call God, and they have this book of guesses about this imaginary being that people made thousands of years ago, and they wrote down their guesses, and now today's Christians allow those guesses about the unknowable to function as ironclad laws and rules governing the Christian's behavior if they want to get into an imaginary heaven or avoid going to an imaginary hell. And a realistic view, of course, says that A, we can't know anything about unobservable beings, and B, an afterlife is improbable, extremely improbable, because our consciousness itself is clearly a product of the living organic brain, which creates our field of consciousness. And when that brain stops functioning, that's a brain of 120 billion neurons or more, the most complicated piece of technology we know of on the planet, and it's there for the purpose of creating our field of consciousness. And whenever that piece of technology turns itself off, by turning off the consciousness circuits when we go into dreamless sleep, then our consciousness simply vanishes. It just isn't present because our brain is temporarily not producing our consciousness. Same thing happens when we're under anesthesia during an operation. Our brain stops generating our consciousness, and therefore our consciousness does not exist. And so this is in contrast to the Christian idea, which actually goes back at least to Plato, of the idea that there is a packet of consciousness called a soul. And this packet of consciousness exists independently of the body, but at some point that packet of consciousness enters the body and inhabits the body during the body's lifetime. When the body dies, then that packet of consciousness can continue to exist. It floats out into space, and it goes on to some kind of an afterlife, and at that point, God can assign it to heaven or hell. This is a mythological idea. It's not based on science at all. The science tells us that when our brain stops, our consciousness stops. Our experience stops. And absolutely nothing happens for absolutely no time at all. You could take the smallest amount of time that you could possibly imagine, and that would be infinitely longer than the amount of time we spend being dead. We spend zero time being dead, because being dead means our brain is not functioning, our brain is not creating our consciousness, so therefore our consciousness does not exist. And therefore time doesn't exist, because you have to have consciousness to be able to be aware of the passing of time. So being dead is the shortest thing that it is in the universe. We cannot actually be dead. We can only be alive and conscious. And then when our consciousness is not there, we are not there, and therefore we can't be anything at all. So it's impossible to be dead because we have already vanished. That's why Epicurus said, if I don't have anything to do with death, because if I'm here, death's not here. But if death is here, I've already stopped being. So we don't have to worry about an afterlife. We don't have to worry about trying to please God because nobody can know what would please God. Nobody can know if we do this, if it'll please God, or if we do that, it'll please God. It's just human guesses about a being that we have no reason to believe actually exists. It might exist. I hope there are benevolent, invisible forces out there, but I can't know whether there are or not, and I can't know what would please them or not. Therefore, I'm thrown back on my own intelligence and my own decisions about what's right and wrong. A realistic ethics is an ethics of autonomy. Autonomy means self-rule. Auto, self, nomos, rule. Autonomy means making our own decisions for ourselves, ethically and in all other aspects of our lives. What we ourselves decide is right and wrong is up to us. Now, society will tell us that certain things are wrong and we will be punished if we do them. Society has laws which are made, hopefully, by a sampling of the community sentiment so that we all agree that these laws are good. Traffic laws are good. If we didn't have traffic laws, we would have so many more people killed in traffic accidents. So it's good to have traffic laws. It's good to follow and obey the traffic laws. Because if we do that, then if we obey the traffic laws and if the people around us obey the traffic laws, then we will all stay safe. But when people break the traffic laws, then they can kill or injure themselves or other people. So traffic laws are good, as are most of the laws that society enacts, but not all of them. Some laws invade our own personal rights. For instance, our right to use chemicals to enhance our consciousness. If we can do that, if that makes us happier, and if we can do that without annoying other people in any serious way, then there's no reason we shouldn't have the right to use whatever chemicals we can, the psychedelics particularly, cannabis and LSD, MDMA and psilocybin and mescaline. If we can use them in a responsible way for ourselves, that should be our right because our consciousness belongs to ourself. And the only things that are wrong for us to do are when we do something that injures somebody else. So as long as we can take psychedelics responsibly and not engage in dangerous behaviors for other people, then that's our right to do that. But autonomous ethics, the ethics of autonomy, means that we are going to decide for ourselves in any particular situation what we think is the right thing to do. And sexuality is the most interesting area of this, and it's the one where Christianity has imposed very rigid rules in the past, and our culture has already now de facto accepted the idea that each person can decide for themselves what they want to do sexually, as long as anybody that they do it with is a consenting partner. The Christian purity culture, sexual purity, if we think about sexual hygiene is an excellent thing, an excellent goal to strive for. We should all strive to be sexually healthy and to remain sexually healthy and to protect our sexual health the best we can. We shouldn't go around recklessly engaging in sexual behavior that's going to damage our sexual health or somebody else's sexual health. So sexual hygiene is a good thing. But sexual purity, the way that Christians talk about it, is something different than that. It's not based on reality. It's based on magic, treating sex as something magic, and treating sex because it's something magic, it's something God-given, according to the Christians, and therefore God has the right to prescribe how we're going to use this magic power of sexuality that God has given us. But that argument is completely invalid because it's a whole series of false truth claims. First, the truth claim that God exists. Second, the truth claim that God gave us sexuality, and therefore God has the right to tell us how to use our sexuality. All of those are false truth claims because they're based on the false premise that we can know anything about an unobservable imaginary being, such as God is supposed to be. We can't know whether God exists or not because we can't observe God. We can't prove that, there's no reason to say that sexuality came from God. Sexuality is something that belongs to all living organisms, all complex living organisms on this planet, reproduce sexually, one way or another. And so sexuality is a power that has been given to us by the evolutionary process of natural selection. And natural selection, it wasn't sitting there with its natural selection brain deciding to give us sex. Natural selection doesn't have a brain, it's just a process. It has no consciousness. Natural selection is simply shorthand for saying that some individuals in every species on the planet, some individuals are able to survive and are able to mate and exchange their genetic material with another individual from the same species, and that mixed genetic material can develop into a new organism. And that's what sex is. Sex is the mixing of genetic information from one individual and another individual, melding them together and making a third individual. And this is not a magic process. This is a completely natural process, a biological process that's been around for over 600 million years. And it's given to us as part of the rest of our package of being humans, given to us by our parents, by the genetic information from one parent merging with the genetic information from another parent, creating a third individual, which is us. And our genetic information plus the nutrients that we get from the outside built our body, built our nervous system. And our nervous system was built using the information in our genes, the genetic information there, built our nervous system. And our nervous system was built with an emotional brain, and the emotional brain within the larger brain. The emotional brain was responsible for motivating us to do certain activities in order to continue to survive and to reproduce ourselves and to take care of the new individuals that we have created through sexual reproduction. This is a process that has been selected for by the natural course of things. That if there were individuals who didn't have a sex drive, they didn't reproduce themselves, they didn't pass on their genes, and the individuals who did have a sex drive did pass on their genes. And individuals who were not smart enough to survive got eaten or killed before they could pass on their genes. Individuals who were smart enough to survive were able to pass on their genes to the next generation. That's the process of natural selection, and that's what created sexuality. Human sexuality is not the product of an invisible imaginary being in the sky. It's the product of hundreds of millions of years of a natural process called natural selection that involves sexual reproduction. And what it has done, what natural selection has done, it has created very strong sexual impulses in the human emotional brain. Meaning that when our brain becomes mature, sexually mature, when we reach puberty, around 11, 12, 13 years of age, somewhere in there, at that point, the sexual circuits of our emotional brain mature and become fully active under the influence of hormones coming from our ovaries or our testes, depending on which sex we are. The hormones from our sex organs cause the sexual circuits in our emotional brain to become fully mature and start being active. And what that means is they start recognizing certain people, certain situations in the environment as being sexually arousing. Our sexual circuits in the emotional brain recognize sexy people, sexy situations, sexy activities, and those circuits in the emotional brain respond to the sexy situation they have recognized. They respond to that situation with something called sexual arousal. Sexual arousal is an emotional response to a situation which our emotional brain has recognized as being a sexy situation with a sexy person or a sexy thought or fantasy in our imagination. The emotional brain will respond to either a real or an imagined situation, and it will respond with sexual arousal. And sexual arousal is a form of output from the emotional brain. The input to the emotional brain is the presence of a sexy person or a sexy situation or the fantasy of a sexy person and situation. That's the input to the emotional brain. The emotional brain recognizes that input as sexy, and the emotional brain then sends output, and that's what's called sexual arousal. And it's a form of emotional arousal, just like becoming happy and laughing, or becoming sad and crying, or becoming angry. Any of these are emotional responses. Becoming sexually aroused is an emotional response. All of them are created by the emotional brain, but there are specific circuits within the emotional brain for each of the different emotions: fear, anger, love, happiness, laughter, sadness, anger, etc. And sexiness, sexual arousal, it has its own circuits. In sexual arousal, the emotional brain gives us really two main things. It gives us a feeling in our consciousness of being turned on, of being sexually turned on. And that feeling is a unique emotion, the emotion of being sexually aroused, sexually turned on, feeling chemistry for someone else, feeling sexual chemistry for someone else, is a way of saying that our emotional brain has become sexually aroused and is creating a feeling of being sexually turned on in our consciousness. So that's the first thing that the emotional brain does in sexual arousal. The other main thing it does in sexual arousal is to arouse our body, arousing our sex organs, and it does that by sending nerve impulses down our spine, down the spinal cord. Those nerve impulses go to the nerves in our sexual organs and causes the arteries. The arteries are blood vessels. Blood vessels flowing, bringing blood into our sexual organs. Those blood vessels enlarge, they relax, they open up, and the emotional brain also makes the heart pump harder and faster when we get sexually turned on. So the heart is pumping blood into all the bloodstream, the whole circulation of our body, thousands and thousands and thousands of blood vessels. And particularly the ones going to the sex organs now, when they open up, when those blood vessels open up, the blood that the heart is pumping is now able to flow into the blood vessels. It causes the penis to become erect. It causes the clitoris to become erect. It causes the vagina to swell up and open up a bit. And it causes the vagina to release fluid into the interior of the vagina that comes out and moistens the labia at the entrance to the vagina. This is the physiological side of sexual arousal. And we get a warm feeling in our genitals, a pleasant, warm feeling in our genitals as these changes occur. And this is then the physical side of the emotion of being sexually turned on. The physical side of the emotion of finding something funny is laughing. That's the physical expression of finding something funny. But the physical expression of finding something sexy is becoming turned on, having our sex organs become physically aroused and feeling that sense of being sexually turned on in our consciousness. At that point, if we actually begin to engage in some kind of sexual activity, particularly any kind of activity where we're touching or stroking our sex organs, either touching them ourselves or bringing them into contact with someone else's body and using their body to stimulate our sex organs, there is physical sexual pleasure that is generated from the sex organs. And there are nerve receptors on our sex organs that pick up those pleasure sensations, and they bring them back up the spine and into the brain. And so we now feel another sensation. Besides the sensation of being sexually turned on, we feel the sensation of physical sexual pleasure. And that mingles with our feeling of being sexually turned on emotionally, creating bliss in consciousness. And that's a special kind of sexual bliss that comes from sexual physical sensations mingling with sexual emotional sensations. And when that combination of emotional and physical sensations in our consciousness becomes too intense to handle, then our emotional brain triggers another part of the sexual response cycle, the climactic part of the sexual response cycle. The first part is getting aroused and then going into high arousal, and then the third part of the sexual response cycle is not just feeling those emotions, but triggering a reflex. A reflex is an involuntary muscular contraction of some part of our body. Laughter is actually a muscular reflex of our lungs and throat. And orgasm is like that, like laughter. It's an involuntary contraction of the muscles surrounding our sex organs. Those contractions cause ejaculation in the male, and his semen spurts out of the tip of his penis. With each ejaculation, with each contraction of the muscles, a new spurt of semen is ejaculated or thrown out of the penis. And then in the female, the orgasmic contractions can cause the vagina to contract and contractions of the muscles around the clitoris. And those orgasmic contractions send nerve impulses back up to the brain again. And when they reach the brain, they flow through the brain as the pulses of orgasmic pleasure, waves of orgasmic pleasure that wash through consciousness one after another as the muscle contractions are happening in our sex organs. And when the orgasm reflex finally reaches its conclusion and those muscle contractions stop, then the pleasurable waves of orgasmic pleasure also stop flowing through consciousness. Now, that's the natural way that the sexual response cycle is supposed to occur. There's a stimulus on the outside, a sexy situation or person that we recognize or a thought that we recognize, that the emotional brain says, wow, that's sexy, and it responds with sexual arousal. And then we engage in sexual activity, which creates more and more pleasure in the brain. And finally, the brain triggers the orgasm reflex, and the contractions of the muscles in our sex organs at that point create another type of pleasure, a further type of complete pleasure that satisfies us with an orgasm. And afterwards, we're ready to relax. If we've had a really good orgasm, we're ready to relax. Sometimes some women who are multiply orgasmic, they will not lose their desire for further sexual pleasure. After just one orgasm, they're willing to be able to have more and more sexual pleasure. Their brains are built to take multiple orgasms if they can get the stimulation, the emotional and the physical stimulation to trigger the orgasm reflex. But for men and for many women, one orgasm, more or less, brings about a change in the circuitry of the emotional brain. The sexual circuits just shut down. Okay, we've done our job. We've given the orgasm. The orgasm is what's supposed to result in reproducing the species, creating a new individual. At least that's from the evolutionary point of view. That was its original purpose. That doesn't mean we have to limit ourselves to orgasms that will create other individuals. It's much better if we have lots of orgasms that don't create other individuals, except when we really want to create a child. But other than that, the emotional brain is built so that after there is an orgasm, then there's no further desire for sexual activity at the moment in many people. In anybody who's not multiply orgasmic, the one orgasm results in calming down, losing the desire for any further sexual activity, and being able to go on with our lives without being distracted by sexual desire. So that's the natural way that we should learn to use our sexual response cycle, starting when we are at puberty, starting when those sexual circuits in the emotional brain fully mature and become capable of producing spontaneous sexual arousal and capable of enjoying sexual pleasure and triggering the orgasm reflex. And we should learn to have that happen in our brains and in our bodies, because then we'll be able to enjoy sexuality throughout our entire life. Because we're going to have sexual desires, because the desire for sexual pleasure is built into our emotional brains. It's the sex drive. We are driven to have more sexual pleasure on a regular basis. Human beings have one of the highest sex drives of any species, and we have it all of the time, year-round. It's not like we go through a specific season when we all get horny and have sex, and then for the rest of the year we don't worry about sex. That's the way it is with a lot of species. But for the human species, we are interested in sex year-round, and it's good for us and healthy for us to give ourselves orgasms the year-round, as long as we do it in an ethical way, in an ethically responsible way. Now, the ethics of autonomy, self-rule, the ethics of deciding for ourselves, differs from the ethics of authority in a specific way. In the ethics of authority, the authority, some higher authority that's supposed to know more than we do, tells us what to do, and we're a good person if we do what the authority tells us, and we're a bad person if we don't do what the authority tells us. And we don't question whether the authority is right in what it tells us to do. We just have to accept it, because the authority doesn't allow that. The authority says, no, you are not allowed to question whether this is right or wrong. You just have to obey. And if you obey, then we consider you good. And if you disobey, we consider you bad. So goodness and badness in an authoritarian ethics depends exclusively on whether we obey the authority or not. And so if we obey the authority, we're not responsible for the consequences. If we obey the authority, if the authority says, for instance, you can only have sex when you get married, and when you get married, you're not allowed to have birth control, you're only allowed to have sex in order to have children. And so we get married and we have children, and we have 12 children or 15 children or 16 children, as people were doing in the Victorian age, then that, we're not responsible. I was just, following orders. I'm helping overpopulate the planet drastically, but you can't hold me responsible for that. I'm just doing what the authority told me to do, even though it's wrecking and destroying the planet by having way too many kids. All right. I can get away with it because I'm just following the rules. But if I'm responsible and I use birth control and my wife and I only have 1 or 2 children, or maybe 3 at the most, I'm bad if I belong to a church that says that you shouldn't use birth control, that the authority, that God doesn't want you to use birth control. God wants you only to use your sex drive in order to make children, and your sex drive doesn't belong to you. Your sex drive belongs to God because he magically put it in you. That's an authoritarian system that is built on false truth claims about the unknowable, God. All right? It's built on a whole series of false truth claims, unrealistic truth claims. But if you believe in that system and you follow that system and obey that system, then you're good, even if you overpopulate the world. But if you're responsible and control the number of children you have, then you're bad because you've disobeyed the authority, even though that's better for the human race and better for the planet. So authorities can be irrational, particularly when the authority that you're using is ideas that were dreamed up by people 2,000-3,000 years ago, who knew absolutely nothing about biology and contraception and anything else. And they're completely superstitious ideas that are completely outmoded. But nevertheless, if you belong to that particular authoritarian group, according to the ethics of authority, you have to just obey the authority, even if it's an irrational authority. And what I mean by irrational is that it causes, that if you follow that authority's rules, you will cause more unhappiness than happiness. You will cause distress instead of happiness. And ultimately, it will be a bad thing individually for our individual happiness and for the happiness of the planet. That's what I mean by irrational, when you get rules that end up creating unhappiness rather than happiness. But if you follow the ethics of authority, you don't have to take responsibility for the consequences of your actions, as long as your actions are following the rules of the irrational authority. Like the person who was in charge of the concentration camps in World War II and said, I don't have to take responsibility for that. I was just following the orders of the authority, of the Führer, of Adolf Hitler, and his authorities. So I'm not responsible. I was just following orders. The ethics of autonomy is entirely different from that. The ethics of deciding for ourselves, autonomos, self-rule, autonomy, deciding for ourselves what we believe is the right thing to do in a situation or the wrong thing to do in a situation. For instance, if I'm going to be having sex with someone, and there's a possibility of one or the other of us getting pregnant, which in my case, of course, would be the other person rather than me. In any case, I have the responsibility of deciding for myself whether to use contraception or not. And actually, the two of us, as autonomous individuals, autonomous partners, make that decision together, and we have to decide whether we want to have children or not. And if having a child is not something we want to do, then we are responsible and we use contraception because we know we're going to be responsible for the consequences of our actions. If we decide that we want to have children, then we go ahead and have sex without contraception, and we're happy that we had the child, and so that's a good thing. But if we don't want to have children, and we're not ready to have children, we're not ready to settle down, get married, and raise a family, and we decide not to use contraception, we irresponsibly decide not to use contraception, and the female gets pregnant, the woman gets pregnant, and we create an unwanted child, this can create unhappiness for all of us, unhappiness that could have been prevented if we had been responsible enough in our decision-making to use contraception. But since we weren't responsible when we had sex, We are now responsible afterwards, when the child is born, of taking care of the child, and we have responsibility for that. So, autonomous ethics, we are responsible for the consequences of our action, and that's why we have to be intelligent and think about not just the immediate pleasure that we might be having in the moment, but thinking about the longer consequences that might occur and the possibilities that might occur in the future. And so we have to look at the situation realistically. We can't say, well, I'm going to pray that we don't get pregnant and hope that that works. Hope is not a plan of contraception. Okay? Hope is magic. Hope doesn't work on biology. Okay? So, in my opinion, we can sum up ethics. First of all, we can sum up ethics in 2 words. Be nice. Be nice to yourself and be nice to everybody else. But here are some other guidelines. First of all, besides autonomy, taking responsibility for our own actions. Secondly, happiness rather than unhappiness should be our goal. Happy states of consciousness, euphoric states of consciousness, are the only things that have absolute value, or the only things that have value in and of themselves. Okay, they are the end point, whether something that we do makes us happy or not. And so our ethical actions should be intentionally aimed at creating happiness rather than distress for ourselves and for anybody else anybody else who's in the situation with us, who will be directly affected by whatever actions and decisions we make, whatever choices we make. We want to be, and why do we care about the other people's happiness? Because we believe in equality of human consciousness, that every human consciousness is equally important, equally capable of experiencing distress, equally capable of experiencing euphoria, and therefore no person's euphoria or distress is unimportant. Everyone's happiness is important. Everyone's distress is important. And so that's why there's a sense of equality, that we are aiming for happiness, and we are aiming for happiness equally for all of us if possible. Thirdly, we need to use our intelligence so that we can foresee realistically the possible consequences of our actions. And then we need to be not only intelligent and realistic, but we need to respect each other's individual rights. We all have certain rights. We have the right to inviolability of our person and of our consciousness. That is, nobody should do things to our body without our consent, and nobody should do things to our mind without our consent, like implanting crazy imaginary ideas in our mind when we're a child. That is violating the child's intellectual integrity. So those are some of the ideas for a sensible ethic. And so you can use an acronym if we wanted to say that we are the inheritors of good fortune when we behave ethically. We could say that we are the heir to good fortune, H-E-I-R. H, happiness, E, equality, I, intelligence, and R, be realistic, be responsible, and respect other people's rights. Happiness, equality, intelligence, realism, responsibility, and respect for other people's rights. If we do that, then we are behaving rationally, and we are behaving in an ethical manner. And we don't have to feel guilty about what we're doing. So there's a lot of things in sexuality, for instance, that an authoritarian system might condemn, that an autonomous system of ethics would approve of, such as two people of the same sex, the same gender, who are attracted to each other and who have sex with each other, give each other sexual pleasure, as long as they are being careful with sexual hygiene, and as long as they're both wanting to do this, and as long as nobody's heart is getting broken. There's no reason for two people of the same sex not to enjoy sexual pleasure on exactly the same basis as people from different sexes. Our emotional brain is built to recognize sexy situations. Some people's emotional brain happens to be built to find members of their own sex, their own gender, sexually arousing. And so that's a natural sexual response from their emotional brain. And if they enjoy sexual pleasure and can satisfy their sexual drive with each other in a safe and hygienic way, and making each other happy, then it's nobody else's business to condemn them or make any judgment against them. The only people whose opinion really counts in a sexual situation are the people who are involved in it. They're the ones whose happiness or unhappiness counts. It's not up to onlookers from the outside to say, oh, you shouldn't be doing that because I wouldn't like doing that, and so you shouldn't do it. That's not a good basis, but most people, that's the basis they use for making sexual judgments is, I wouldn't enjoy having sex with someone of my own sex. So those people who do enjoy it, there must be something wrong with them. It's not there's something wrong with them. They have a different set of circuits in their emotional brain. Everybody's brain is different. Everybody's body is different. And a whole bunch of people have circuits in their emotional brains which are capable of becoming sexually aroused by members of their own sex rather than the other sex. And that's just as natural and just as ethically approvable as heterosexual sex. Okay, thank you very much for listening. Talk to you again soon.